From an old foe of his mentor to one of the most dominant title-winning performances of all time, here are 7 examples of Islam Makhachev embarrassing his opponents. To truly understand the career of Islam Makhachev, having an appreciation of what Khabib Nurmagomedov did certainly helps. He was the one who laid the foundation, putting the work of his late father Abdulmanap into practice. Khabib's ability to dominate his opponents using his unique approach to wrestling was truly a joy to behold. But in his long list of perfect performances, there is one fight that stands out as being truly tricky for Khabib. We're talking, of course, about his fight with Gleison Tibau. Anyone who knows anything about Tibau can tell you that this dude is a physical freak. And with his own wrestling skills, he was able to stop Khabib's takedown for the majority of the fight. Jump forward several years to Makhachev's rise, and the UFC decided to set Islam up for a fight with Gleison, just as they had done with his mentor. And boy did Islam Makhachev come out with a point to prove. Where Khabib took 3 rounds to take home a close decision, Islam steamrolled Tibau in under a minute, KOing him with a statement win. It was clear that this was a big moment for Makhachev, and from there, his notoriety began to grow, so much so that the UFC started to realize his worth early on. And when Cajun Johnson started making noise outside of the octagon, criticizing the UFC for their practices, and talking about fighter unions and all that other stuff Dana White hates, it was clear that the promotion wanted him to shut up. And after he overcame a string of tough matchups, the UFC decided to feed him to Islam Makhachev, confident that the Dagestani destroyer would shut him up once and for all. And on fight night, that's exactly what happened. Makhachev was just on a whole other level, and with relative ease, he cut through Johnson's defenses, eventually getting him out of there with an armbar just before the end of the first round. It was a total cakewalk for Islam, and conclusive proof of his growing reputation as the division's most feared prospect. And when the competition levels rose, Islam only grew in his ability to meet them. Next came the incredibly underrated Drew Dober, a man who to this day is known for his insane toughness and uncoachable determination. He's a guy who loves nothing more than to bite down on his mouthpiece and let his fists and his massive chin see him through. But in there with Islam, his strengths just weren't given any room to shine through. Dober is tough, but this was an incredibly defensive display. He was in survival mode from the get-go, and while the fight lasted until round 3, that was mainly just 3 rounds of struggling for Dober. Eventually, the arm triangle came, and that was all she wrote. But for as tough a night out as Dober had, his performance looked like a masterpiece in comparison to Dan Hooker. Like Drew Dober, Hooker is known for his grit, his determination, and his willingness to throw caution to the wind. Well, in this case, that willingness saw him decide to sign on the dotted line to take on Makhachev on very short notice. Sounds like the decision of a madman, right? Well, the rewards here for Hooker were obviously enticing enough to go for it. But when the cage doors closed, everyone was forced to accept a tough reality. Islam Makhachev was proving himself to be a major title threat, and not in a prospect kind of way like he was a work in progress. No, this dude was ready now. And in there with Dan Hooker, it really showed. This was like watching a black belt toying with a white belt, except Islam was in no mood to waste any time. By the 2-minute mark, he had found his way to the Kimura, and in that moment, Hooker's chances of winning basically fell to 0. As soon as Islam started cranking, you knew the tap was coming. And thankfully, Hooker decided enough was enough before things got truly ugly. But he wasn't the only fighter who made this mistake of accepting a bout with Islam Makhachev on short notice. No, a similar fate also befell Bobby Green. When an opponent of Makhachev's, Beneil Dariush, was forced out of their fight due to an injury, fresh off of a huge victory that saw him showcasing some real flair and swagger, Green decided to try and go double or nothing. And so he accepted a rapid turnaround fight with the most dominant wrestler in the division. Unfortunately, Green never had the opportunity to put those amazing striking skills to work. No, Islam did what Islam does best. He found the takedown early and proceeded to mercilessly beat up Bobby Green. And this is pretty much how the fight played out, until the ref stepped in to award Islam the TKO victory. It just doesn't matter how good you are at striking. A great wrestler like Makhachev can make your night a living hell if you don't have the ability to keep him off you. And once he has you on the mat, you can be the greatest striker who ever walked the face of the earth, but good luck putting it to use. However, while the stylistic matchup was always going to be tough for Green, people pointed to the UFC lightweight champion Charles Oliveira as a potential foil for Makhachev. Oliveira not only had a much better and more dangerous striking game than Islam, but as the holder of the most submission victories in UFC history, a guy who could snatch a neck or a limb without even the slightest warning, yeah, it seemed like Islam could have been in trouble for this one. Makhachev might have had the longer win streak, but Do Bronx was the one carrying some major mainstream momentum. As a longtime fan favorite who could never truly find the consistency to be a high-level contender, the new version of Charles Oliveira seemed destined to finally stop the Islam hype train in its tracks. UFC 280 was the event, and that packed arena could barely hold it together as the main event approached. So, did the fight live up to expectations? Well, kind of. Islam Makhachev made this so insanely uncompetitive from start to finish that made us all wonder why we ever thought Oliveira could be a threat. Charles just didn't seem himself in there. He was flat, uninspired, and seemed hesitant to engage in anything that might lead to Islam getting the takedown. This is the dude who has the most submissions in UFC history. That tells you a lot about what he thinks of Makhachev's game. From there, a strong opening round for Islam left Charles looking deflated in the second, but the biggest shock of all was soon to follow. After Charles jumped in recklessly, Makhachev countered him immediately and actually dropped Do Bronx to the canvas. We all suspected that Islam was going to have great success on the mat, but for him to carve out an advantage in the striking department as well? Yeah, that was something crazy to behold. From there, the fight was all but finished. There was no real bottom game threat coming back at him. No Charles, against all odds, had no answer for Makhachev on the mat. Islam sliced through his opponent's defenses like they weren't even there, eventually latching onto the arm triangle choke that won him the UFC lightweight title. The greatest submission artist in the history of the UFC trapped like his life depended on it. There was a new king in town, and while we're certainly not going to try and claim that Makhachev embarrassed Volkanovski in his first title defense, because that fight was just about as closely contested about as you'll ever see. But hold on a second, guys. This video ain't over just yet. No, we have a bonus entry, courtesy of some well-placed cameras in the AKA gym. Islam was training on his wrestling against a young American wrestler named Chase Saldate, when he decided to go for a move that had even the great Daniel Cormier losing his mind. And so this viral moment was born. He pulled off a rare Russian tie snap with such precision, taking the back in the process, that it pretty much brought the session to a momentary halt. That was some crazy slick wrestling from the champ, and we'll point out that he wasn't even the champ at 155 yet. Islam Makhachev is just on another level, folks. And by the looks of things, he has been for quite some time. From a spot on the prelims to his status as champion of the world, Islam Makhachev has made a career on the back of his ability to impress his opponents.